I said trespass.
I'm about to get, yo.
Hi, my name is Dave Champion. I'm the host of the Dave Champion television show. I'm a former United States Army Airborne Ranger. I have a law enforcement background. I'm also the owner of Combat Dynamics Group. And we're here together today to talk about two concepts: reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Now, most Americans are unfamiliar with these terms except having heard them once or twice. However, they are fundamental to the protection of your rights when you come in contact with law enforcement. There was recently a video that appeared on YouTube of a situation that developed on the East Coast that illustrates the failure, in many cases, of police officers to properly apply the concepts of reasonable suspicion and probable cause, and we thought we would use that video as a learning experience for all Americans. So let's roll the video.
Niggas catch me out here sipping on this motherfucking Arizona and shit, you know what I'm saying? Just thinking, just waiting for my nigga Moore to come through, shoot this TTT.
Game pulled up.
Oh yeah.
He was right behind him.
That wasn't him?
Sure, but that wasn't him.
All right. This gentleman you see over my shoulder is the victim. And I say victim because he is in a very real sense a victim of a police officer who is acting both unconstitutionally and illegally, and we'll dissect why exactly that is. Now, as the video progresses, you may note that our victim, well, depending on where you're from, your lifestyle, may not be your kind of guy. He may not be somebody you would invite to the company Christmas party. But that is not at all the point. Even though he may not be your kind of guy, he is still entitled to the full protections of the law. And in this case, he has done absolutely nothing wrong, and he is being abused by the unconstitutional and illegal conduct of a police officer. So let's take a look and roll the video.
Get Cuzzo out. Huh? Drink. Look at the tea. What's wrong with you?
Yeah. You got alcohol in there?
Oh, ain't got no alcohol in it. You see this? Sweet tea, pink lemonade. Who is you?
Police.
Okay. You see what I'm drinking?
Let me look at it.
You is looking at it. No laws?
Yeah, that's an invasion of privacy, but I got it
read
on
it. You
camera.
don't gotta touch
so I
me.
can read the ingredients.
You read it. Ingredients. No, matter of fact, look and see what it is.
I want
Go
to
to
do
the
it. You ain't
gas
got to
station.
show him.
Go to the
You ain't
gas
gotta
station
show
and
him.
see what it is.
First of all, he's an
Go
officer
to the
cop.
gas
You
station.
don't even know if he's really a cop.
He ain't showing me no
badge or nothing.
identification for no reason.
All right, let's review what we've seen thus far. Our victim is standing innocently in the parking lot of a liquor store when he's approached by a man who eventually identifies himself as a police officer, who demands to see what the victim is drinking. Now, that insofar as we've gone so far, that's not a bad thing, because many states have a law that prohibit people from consuming alcohol on the premises, in the parking lot, for instance, of a licensed establishment that sells alcohol. So, under state law, the officer may very well have the authority, the grounds to inquire as to what a person is drinking while they're on the grounds of the licensed alcohol selling establishment. The police officer walks up and he does exactly that. Now, I think most Americans, up to this moment, would have no problem with the police officer's conduct. However, our victim shows him the can, clearly says Arizona iced tea. He actually turns the can around directly in front of the police officer's eyes and shows the police officers the ingredients on the back, thus validating to the police officer that there is no alcohol in the product. At that moment in time, once the police officer has seen that the product has no alcohol, he loses all legal authority to go further. However, he chooses to go further anyway, and he demands to take possession of the victim's property. Now, in law, that's called a seizure. And in certain cases, a police officer may seize or search or both an item, provided that he has something called reasonable suspicion. Now, this brings us squarely to the moment where we have to discuss what the law says reasonable suspicion is. So the definition of reasonable suspicion is an objectively justifiable suspicion that is based on specific facts or circumstances that justifies a peace officer stopping a person thought to be involved in a criminal activity at the time. Another definition is a police officer possesses reasonable suspicion if he has enough knowledge to lead a reasonably cautious person to believe that criminal activity is occurring and that the individual played some part in it. Now, let's deconstruct the relationship between the officer and his victim now that we have the definitions of reasonable suspicion. I should say that the difference between having reasonable suspicion and not having it is the ability for a police officer to hold a non-consensual contact with you. In other words, you don't have the right to leave, or a consensual contact. In other words, if the officer does not have reasonable suspicion, then his contact with you on your part is voluntary. That's called a consensual contact. You can tell whenever you're talking to a police officer if it's a consensual contact or non-consensual by simply asking the question, "Officer, am I free to leave now?" If he says yes, it's consensual and you can walk away. If he says no, it's a non-consensual contact, which constitutionally requires him at that moment to have reasonable suspicion. So, when the officer approaches the victim in this video, it must, at first blush, be a consensual contact because the officer is fishing. He does not know what is in that can, therefore he cannot have reasonable suspicion. He comes up on a fishing expedition, which is fine, provided he plays by the rules, and the contact is a voluntary or consensual contact. So he walks up to the victim and he says, "What's in the can?" The victim does an excellent job of showing him what the can is and the ingredient listing. At that point, the officer loses all authority because the crime that he was fishing for, clearly the evidence indicates it does not exist. Now, somebody may be saying, "Well, you know, Dave, that could have been some form of alcohol that the victim put inside that can." Well, that's true, it could have been. But here's the thing. The courts have held that reasonable suspicion is not based on gut instinct or a hunch. Remember, the definition was there are facts and circumstances that the officer can articulate that would lead a reasonably cautious person to assume that such is so. Well, now that the victim showed the can, Arizona iced tea, turned it around for the officer to see the ingredients, there's no alcohol in it, can you articulate the reasons why the facts show there should be something other than iced tea in the can? No, because there are no articulatable facts to support that. That requires a leap that the facts do not support, therefore reasonable suspicion cannot go there. It's also important to understand that police officers do not function on any personal authority. The only authority they have is that authority established in law. That's a very important thing. Police officers only have the authority established in law, not what they might want to have, not what they might feel that they want to seize extra authority at that moment because, well, they're in a mood to do that. The law doesn't permit that. Their job description doesn't permit that. So when the police officer in this case said, "What are you drinking?" and he got an answer, the answer was crystal clear and there was no facts to the contrary, his fishing expedition was over. And the result of his fishing expedition was he wound up with zero reasonable suspicion to continue the contact. What he should have said at that point was, "Thank you very much for your cooperation. Have a great day." Recognizing as a professional, that's the moment he'd come to, and he should have walked away. But is that what he did? No, it's not. Let's continue with the video.
You don't even know if he's really a cop.
He ain't show me no identification for no reason.
Leave the property.
For
You got
what?
5 seconds to leave. I can see that.
For what?
Property now.
Yeah, for what though? What's
what?
the crime?
We got the
Trespass.
camera.
What's the crime?
Trespassing. Leave the property. Hey, what you got?
26 and fed now.
You got 5 seconds left. Put your hands up against the car. Put your hands up against the car
I'm not
now.
touching you, man.
Put your hands up against the car
I'm not
now.
doing nothing, man.
Sir,
Yo,
put your hands up against the car. You're under arrest.
yo, for what? I'm about to go. Yo, you want to drink
You're
this?
under arrest.
All right, so in everything we just saw, there was a lot of dialogue back and forth, yes? Was there anything said by the officer or by the victim that created the reasonable suspicion that the officer didn't have originally? No, nothing. It was just back and forth. And really what we're observing is we're observing the police officer simply not liking, that was a feeling, simply not liking that he can't have his way, even though the law doesn't support him having his way. So at the end, after having no reasonable suspicion, so he's in a non-consensual contact, he demanded to see the item, he wanted to seize it. The very fact that he wanted to seize the property of the victim says that he felt he was acting as if he had reasonable suspicion, when in fact he did not. So now there's back and forth, which does not create any reasonable suspicion. And suddenly, out of the blue, the officer says, "You're under arrest." Now, placing somebody under arrest requires a higher standard of information, a higher standard of facts than does reasonable suspicion. Now, he didn't have enough facts for reasonable suspicion. How in God's name did he get to enough facts for probable cause? So let's talk about what probable cause is. The law defines probable cause as apparent facts discovered through logical inquiry that would lead a reasonably intelligent and prudent person to believe that an accused person has committed a crime, thereby warranting his or her prosecution. Now, in this case, there is no evidence of any crime whatsoever. Now, the officer says, when the victim says, "Arrest me for what?" he says, "Trespass." Now, where a liquor store is privately owned, the trespass distinction has to come from the owner, not from a police officer. That should make sense. A police officer cannot trespass you. The owner has to trespass you. The police officer simply enforces that or takes you into custody. Now, does the law allow a police officer to misapply a statute to somebody who has not in fact committed a crime simply because his nose has been out of shape and he didn't get his way? The answer is clearly no.
You're under arrest.
Yo, for what? I'm about to go. Yo, you want to drink
You're
this?
under arrest.
For what? I ain't doing
Because
nothing.
I said
man.
trespass.
I'm about to get. Yo. Yo.
You're under arrest.
Yo. For what? For what? For what? For what? For what?
Resist delay obstruct.
For what?
Put your hands behind your back, sir.
For what though?
Put your hands behind your back now.
For what? I
Put
ain't
your hands
doing
behind your back.
And this is an Arizona iced tea. I want everybody to see this.
Yo, he can drink the contents.
Half and half Arizona iced tea.
Trespassing, sir.
For what? I'm about to go to the store.
Trespassing. Put your left hand behind
How
your
am I
back. sir.
trespassing?
Put your left hand
How
behind
am
your
I
back.
trespassing?
I got it all on camera. He locked this man up for nothing, fam. For nothing. Nothing. He ain't do
Don't leave
nothing.
property. You're not leaving property.
He thought that was the alcohol, so he
I'm not racist, sir. Girl, look like a white
he didn't do nothing wrong. He ain't do nothing wrong.
I told him leave the property. He did nothing
But he didn't do
wrong.
nothing wrong to leave the property. As a civilian, he has a right to purchase something as a customer if he didn't break a crime. You asked him to leave based on the assumption that that was alcohol, but you were wrong. So he didn't commit no crime. Yo, a lawyer gonna eat this up.
Leave the property now.
Who? What did I do?
You. Criminal investigation. Leave the property now.
I tell you what, I'ma leave. I ain't about to go get locked up. I don't live out here. But my lawyer will be eating this up. My lawyer gonna eat this shit up. I'm leaving. You see me leaving. I could talk, but I'm leaving.
All right, so what have we seen now? We've seen the police officer, without any legal justification whatsoever, abuse reasonable suspicion, didn't exist, then pretend he has probable cause to make an arrest, which he didn't, and then he physically batters the suspect. That battery is an official legal term. Okay? Now, let me be clear about something. When a police officer is acting without reasonable suspicion, without probable cause, and lays his hands on somebody, he is laying his hands on them as a private citizen because the police officer only has the authority vested in him by law. Once he steps outside the law and he's no longer acting within the authority granted to him by the law, he is not technically acting as a police officer anymore. I think our victim acted with about as much cooperation as an innocent man could be expected to give somebody who was illegally and unconstitutionally physically assaulting him. Now, I will tell you my personal feelings. Once the officer had the victim down on the ground, I would love if a bystander had asked the camera person, please turn off the camera, stop videotaping, and then kicked the officer's head clean off of his shoulders. That's what that officer deserves. However, that's my personal feelings. Let's conclude on the legal aspects of what we saw. The officer acted with no reasonable suspicion. He then leaped beyond reasonable suspicion to probable cause that he did not have. Now, why is all of this important to you? It is important to you because police officers typically rely on your ignorance when they contact you. How many of you knew the definition of reasonable suspicion and probable cause and how they both play out prior to watching this video? Police officers rely on you not knowing that. That's why I gave you one of the tools earlier where I said, if you say to a police officer, am I free to go now? That will tell you whether the officer has established that this is a consensual or non-consensual contact. Non-consensual contact means you have been legally detained, you are not free to go. He must have reasonable suspicion to create a non-consensual detainment, or he is in violation of the law. I'm not encouraging people to fight back against law enforcement because legitimate law enforcement is a function we all want in our society. What we don't want is we don't want things like this thug pretending to be a police officer abusing the law, because when they abuse the law, they're abusing you. And you need to be able to understand reasonable suspicion and probable cause so that you can stand up for your rights and make sure that your constitutional protections remain in place when you're in contact with a police officer. In closing, I'd like to make one final comment. Reasonable suspicion is something that police officers oftentimes manufacture after the fact. That's why it's important to ask them, if you say, am I free to go now? And they say no, say, okay, great, I'm legally detained. May I have your reasonable suspicion, please? And get it on the record right then. Now, no good cop manufactures reasonable suspicion after the fact. Good cops have reasonable suspicion to begin with, or they wouldn't be detaining you. I will tell you, however, that about 95% of the police officers out there manufacture reasonable suspicion after the fact. That's why it's important to get it on the record. I hope this helps protect your constitutional rights in the future. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.